The winter of 1867 came heavy and strange in rural Missouri, the kind of cold that carried no wind but pressed into the bones. It was in this stillness that the brick orphanage rose, its 3 stories standing in defiance of the frost-bitten earth. Men from the town had hauled the bricks under Eleanor Whitford's watchful gaze, their wages paid in gold coins she seemed to conjure without effort. The war had left the county hollowed out, the families fractured, and the children too many to name. Eleanor spoke of duty, of God's will, of the need to house the unwanted in a place safe from hunger and sin. The farmers listened because her voice carried the certainty of a woman untouched by doubt, but in private, they said her eyes were not the eyes of a caretaker. They were fixed, unblinking, as though she was memorizing the shape of each child she met, committing them to a list only she could see. The building itself was unlike anything the town had known. Its windows were tall but narrow, admitting light in thin blades that never reached the far corners of the rooms. The front doors were iron-bound oak, heavier than any barn door in the county, and when they shut, the sound was less a closing and more a sealing. On the day of its opening, a small crowd gathered to watch as the first wagons rolled up the long, rutted road. Inside were children, some recently orphaned by fever, some left on church steps, some whose parents had vanished into the post-war migrations. The children did not cry as they were led through the doors. A few looked back, but the moment the shadows of the threshold crossed their faces, their expressions turned blank. As though the warmth of the day, the faces of the onlookers had been erased all at once. Within the first week, the farmers noticed the quiet. It was not the quiet of snow or distance, but something deliberate. No shouts of play, no songs, not even the scrape of boots on the courtyard stones. At night, a light burned in one high window, but no figures moved across it. The absence of sound began to change the air in the town. When wagons approached the orphanage road, their wheels seemed to grow heavier, their horses uneasy. A few mothers swore they could feel a weight in their chests just looking at the building, as though something inside was watching them back. Eleanor made herself visible only when she wished to collect another child. She would arrive in a carriage drawn by 2 black mares, dressed in plain mourning black, though her husband had been dead for nearly a decade. She spoke gently to the children she took, always with a faint smile, never with a hand on their shoulder. That smile, people said, was not warmth. It was ownership. Once a child crossed her steps, they belonged entirely to her care, which meant they belonged to the brick walls that swallowed them. Those who worked briefly in the orphanage before leaving, always without explanation, told of a strange ritual Eleanor performed on the first night each child arrived. In the chapel, lit only by a single lantern, she would make them kneel before a locked cabinet. From within it, she would draw an object wrapped in cloth. No one saw it clearly, but the stories agreed on the sound it made. A faint rattle like seeds in a dry pod. She would hold it to the child's ear and whisper something too soft to catch. Afterward, the child would be sent to bed in one of the upper rooms where the windows did not open and the doors had no latches on the inside. By morning, they no longer spoke unless spoken to. Within a month, the unnatural quiet became so complete that the farmers began to wonder if any children remained at all. Eleanor did not answer questions, and her only public words were at Sunday service, where she spoke of order, discipline, and the removal of the wildness she claimed lived in children born without guidance. Her sermons hinted at something deeper, an idea that war had not only broken the land but had bred corruption into its young. Corruption she believed could be drawn out if one was willing to endure the work. She said the word endure with a kind of reverence, as though she alone understood its full weight. There was one night in that first winter when the quiet broke just for an instant. A farmer hauling wood after dusk swore he heard a single sharp cry from the orphanage, cut off so suddenly it seemed impossible a voice had made it. Then the silence returned, heavier than before. The man never walked that road again after dark. By the end of the season, the town had stopped expecting to see the children outdoors. The courtyard gates remained closed, the bricks gathered frost like pale skin, and the air around the orphanage seemed to absorb sound before it could travel. Eleanor's presence in town was rarer now. When she did appear, she was the same calm figure, her gloves spotless, her hair pinned into place, her eyes fixed on something far beyond the horizon. No one dared to ask what she saw there. And so the building stood, breathing its cold breath into the fields, its windows staring out like the eyes of something patient and watchful. Whatever was happening inside its walls, it left no trace but the silence, and the silence itself became a kind of warning. The town learned to live with it, though in the stillest hours of night some swore they could feel it reaching outward, testing the edges of the world beyond its gates. It was only the beginning. The western wing of the orphanage was a place no child spoke of, though every one of them knew it by the way their bodies stiffened when the corridor door opened. It was narrow and cold, lit by a single oil lamp that always burned low, as if it too feared to see clearly what happened there. Eleanor called it the correction wing, and she said the name without malice, as if it were nothing more than a part of her careful architecture, no different from the chapel or kitchen. To the Yusayil children, it was a place where sound itself went to die. No cries, no whispers, no footfalls ever escaped once the door closed. Even the air on that side of the building felt heavy, damp, reluctant to move. Eleanor's fascination with the wing had begun long before the orphanage was built. In her private journals, she had written with admiration about a Parisian penal reformer who believed that the soul could be purified by erasing the senses, drowning a person in the absence of touch, sight, and sound until their will bent to authority. She called it sensory erasure, though to her it was not erasure at all, it was sculpting. She believed children, especially those from war-broken families, were raw stone, flawed and dangerous, and that she had been given the tools to carve them into something clean. The correction wing was her chisel. The cupboard stood against the far wall, tall as a man but only wide enough for a child's shoulders. They were lined with damp felt that reeked faintly of mold, the fabric always wet enough to cling to the skin. When the door was shut, the felt swallowed every sound, and the air inside turned stale within minutes. Eleanor insisted on this detail, claiming that the faint moisture was necessary for softening defiance. The children were strapped upright inside, arms pinned tight, head held by a wooden brace. Breathing became work. Time dissolved into a fevered blur. Some children lasted hours, some lasted less. When the straps were undone, those who emerged stumbled as though their legs no longer belonged to them. Many came out silent and glassy-eyed, their lips cracked from breathing through the narrow slits in the door. But there were others who never came out at all, their bodies left slumped inside until Eleanor ordered them removed under the cover of night. She called these deaths character resets, as if their lives had been nothing more than drafts of a flawed design. She wrote their names in a private book that no one else was allowed to see, noting the date, the infraction, and the number of minutes they had endured before the body failed. The first time a death occurred in the correction wing, the staff had hesitated. A young girl named Agnes, no older than 9, had been placed inside for speaking after the evening bell. When she collapsed, her face pale and her lips blue, a caretaker ran to fetch Eleanor. The widow arrived without haste, studied the child's body, and simply said, "She was too stubborn to let go." She ordered the body removed to the cellar until burial could be arranged. No one dared to speak of it again. From that night forward, the deaths became part of the building's rhythm. They were not accidents, not failures of judgment. They were method, each one folded neatly into Eleanor's quiet vision. The survivors of the wing were altered in ways the other children could see. Their eyes no longer darted to the windows. Their shoulders sagged inward, and they spoke only when given permission. Fear of the wing kept order far more effectively than kindness or reward ever could. Eleanor herself visited the wing often, not to punish but to observe. She would stand outside the cupboards, one hand resting on the door, listening for the faintest movements inside. Sometimes she would murmur to the child within, not words of comfort but instructions, telling them to breathe slower, to hold still, to imagine themselves empty. She believed she was stripping away the parts of them that resisted her, a sacred work she alone had the will to complete. The psychological toll was not limited to the children. The few remaining staff who had the stomach to stay learned to accept the deaths as part of their duties, though their hands trembled when they tightened the straps. At night they heard the muffled shuffling from the cupboards long after the rest of the orphanage had gone still. Those sounds followed them into their sleep, where they dreamed of narrow spaces and the damp touch of the felt against their own skin. Eleanor, however, slept peacefully. In her mind, the correction wing was proof of her discipline, her refusal to indulge weakness. She spoke of the wing as if it were a school of the soul, and when a child's voice disappeared forever, she saw it as an act of refinement, a flaw removed from her growing collection. To her, the deaths were not tragedies, they were cleanings. Each one confirmed her belief that she was doing what no one else had the resolve to do. As winter deepened, the wing became busier. The air inside grew colder, and the damp felt turned to a chill that seeped into the bones. Eleanor adjusted her methods, ordering the children to be placed inside after being made to drink warm water, so the body heat would rise quickly and the fainting would come faster. She recorded her observations in precise handwriting, as if cataloging a series of controlled experiments. The words, "successful reset," appeared more often. By the season's end, the wing had claimed more than a dozen lives. The surviving children no longer looked at each other when the corridor door opened. They understood without speaking that the wing was always waiting, and that it would take them one by one if Eleanor decided they needed it. The building had swallowed their voices, and in that silence Eleanor's power was absolute. The line between discipline and death no longer existed, only the slow, methodical shaping of lives into something unrecognizable until nothing human remained. The ledger was not meant to be found. It was kept in a locked drawer beneath Eleanor Whitford's writing desk, wrapped in plain muslin cloth to disguise it among household ledgers and donation receipts. But unlike those tidy accounts of money and goods, this book was written in a strange, almost ceremonial hand, the ink heavy, the loops deliberate. It did not contain the children's names. Those had been erased from Eleanor's vocabulary long ago. Instead, each entry began with a single word: obedience, humility, silence, patience, submission. These were the virtues Eleanor believed she could pull from a child the way a surgeon removes a diseased organ. Each word was followed by a date marked as completed, and beneath that another date, colder and unmistakable: the burial. Never a cause of death, never an acknowledgement of breath taken away. To Eleanor, the extraction was the act. The body's ending was simply the sealing of the work. The first page alone told its own quiet horror. Silence, 14th January, buried 15th January. Submission, 22nd January, buried 23rd January. The dates came close together, sometimes only hours apart. She kept no record of the means, but the staff knew. A child stripped of will in the correction wing might be sent to bed, their mind already fractured, their body weakened. Hours later, Eleanor would visit them in the dark, pressing her fingers against the soft hollow of their throat, or holding a damp cloth laced with vinegar and camphor over their mouth until their struggling faded into stillness. She believed this final act locked the virtue in place that the soul, once reshaped, could not be undone. The burials were done in a small field behind the orphanage, a place Eleanor called the resting garden. The ground was poor for crops, but perfect for what she intended. Each grave was dug shallow, no more than 3 feet deep, and into each she ordered quicklime poured over the body to hasten decay. This, she claimed, was not disposal but purification. An echo of old English plague burials where lime was meant to burn away the corruption of disease. But Eleanor added her own element: crushed willow bark, mixed into the soil above the body. She had read once that willow was a tree of sorrow, a symbol of penance, and she told the staff it was necessary to quiet the child's spirit. The smell it produced in the cold months was faintly sweet, a scent that clung to the air around the garden even when the ground was frozen hard. The staff tried not to breathe it in, but they could not help noticing how it lingered on their clothes after a burial, seeping into the skin. Those who handled the bodies most often began to lose their appetite, their dreams filling with the faces of children they had once served meals to. In the ledger, Eleanor never wrote their given names, but in the minds of the staff, those names screamed to be remembered. Still, no one dared to speak them aloud. Eleanor approached the ledger with a discipline that bordered on reverence. Each night before retiring, she would open it, run her fingers over the fresh ink, and reread past entries as if confirming the permanence of her work. She believed that by recording only the virtues, she erased the flawed human being that had carried them, stripping away the rot and leaving behind something incorruptible. The book, she thought, was her, proof to God that she had done his work, that she had not wasted the lives entrusted to her. As the winter stretched on, the entries multiplied, sometimes 2 in a single day. The method was never rushed. Eleanor's patience was a cruelty in itself. She would watch a child for weeks, marking the stages of breaking, how quickly they obeyed, how much eye contact they avoided, whether their hands trembled when they stood in her presence. When she decided a virtue was ready to be taken, she chose the method with care. The suffocations were quiet and quick. The drownings in the shallow copper wash tub were slower. The water warmed so the child would not thrash too violently. Each was an act she believed tailored to the sin she was removing. The garden grew full enough that Eleanor began arranging the graves in deliberate rows, her own strange geometry of the dead. The staff buried them at night, working in silence, the quicklime burning their skin through their gloves, the willow scent thickened the air until their throats ached. The earth froze harder with each passing week, and the men digging began to notice the resistance of the ground where older graves had been laid, as if the soil itself was reluctant to be disturbed again. By late February, the ledger had become more than a record. It was a map of Eleanor's power. Each virtue claimed was another mark of her control, each burial a sign that the world beyond the orphanage no longer had a hold on that child. She told herself she was making saints, not corpses. In truth, she was erasing them so completely that in time even the staff would forget their faces, remembering only the smell of that garden in winter. And still the work went on. The ledger never skipped a day for long. Eleanor's handwriting never faltered, never smudged, as if the cold and death around her could not touch her own body. To her, the garden was proof that the orphanage was not a place of neglect, but of completion. Every death was a finished task. Every grave was a closed chapter. And the ledger was her holy book, one she believed would speak for her when no one else dared. In the quiet of her private quarters, Eleanor wrote as if each word was a confession meant only for God. The ink strokes were slow, deliberate and unshaken, describing her belief that poverty was not merely a condition but a disease carried in the blood, passed from one generation to the next like an invisible stain. She called it ancestral rot and claimed it could not be cured by kindness or education. It had to be drawn out, bled away, and replaced with the purity of obedience. She described her method not as punishment but as cleansing, a sacred work reserved for the strong of will. The hollowing, she called it, and she wrote of it as though it had existed for centuries. An inheritance of discipline handed down through the hands of the devout. She claimed her inspiration came from a 17th century Bavarian monastic ritual, process used on novices thought to be touched by sin. But while the monks had bound their subjects to stillness for days, Eleanor had refined it, shaped it into something that went further, deeper, until nothing human remained. The instrument of her doctrine was the corset, not the silks and whalebone worn by society women, but a device of her own making. Stiff leather stitched by hand, lined with reeds sharpened to fine points. The reeds were positioned so that when the corset was tightened, their tips pressed into the ribs and abdomen. Not enough to pierce the skin, but enough to make every breath ache. The binding was never done in haste. Eleanor would measure the child's chest, fasten the corset snugly, and then over the course of days pull the laces tighter and tighter until their breathing grew shallow, their eyes glassy, and their shoulders permanently hunched forward. At night they were made to sleep upright, the reeds digging deeper as the body slumped. She kept the chosen in a narrow candle-lit room, where the walls were bare and the air thick. They were fed only thin broth, their thirst left half-quenched, so their bodies became light, their skin papery, their minds fevered. By the third day, most began to drift into hallucinations. Eleanor saw this as proof that the ancestral rot was loosening its hold, rising to the surface like oil atop water. She would kneel before them, watching their heads loll to one side, their lips moving soundlessly, and she would murmur that they were being remade, that soon they would be clean. Some lasted a week, others faltered within days, their bodies unable to bear the slow suffocation. The deaths were quiet, almost gentle in their final moment, a simple failure of breath. But Eleanor never recorded them as deaths. In her ledger, she marked them as completions. She believed that those who did not survive had simply been too corrupted to contain the emptiness she sought to create. They were buried the same night, their torsos still bound, the reeds left in place so the transformation could finish underground. For the survivors, if the word could be used at all, release from the corset was no liberation. They stood unsteady, their spines curved, their ribs bruised and tender to the touch. Their eyes no longer sought out others, their voices reduced to whispers. They followed instructions without hesitation, without question, as though a part of them had been scooped out and left behind in the narrow room. Eleanor took their state as a triumph, calling them hollow vessels ready to be filled with virtue. She often assigned them to duties that kept them near the younger children, believing that their empty obedience would serve as an example. The other children saw only ghosts, thin, fragile figures who moved silently, who never smiled, who seemed more shadow than flesh. The hollowing was not random. Eleanor selected her subjects with care, choosing those she deemed most infected by defiance, most in need of breaking. She watched for signs, eyes that lingered on the door, hands that clutched too tightly at food, a posture that refused to bend. When she found them, she approached with calm, speaking gently, luring them into the belief that they were being chosen for something special. By the time the reeds touched their skin, the choice had already been made. The staff, what few remained, avoided the hollowing room unless summoned. Those who had seen the bindings up close spoke in whispers of the sores that bloomed beneath the leather, the way the reeds left faint red crescents pressed into the flesh, and the strange smell that came from the room, a mix of sweat, candle smoke, and something sour like wood left too long in water. They also spoke, when no one else could hear, of the change in Eleanor herself during these sessions. She moved with a deliberate patience, her face serene, as though the act of tightening those laces brought her a peace nothing else could. By spring, the hollowing had claimed more lives than it had spared. The surviving, emptied children became part of the orphanage's machinery, silent gears that kept the place running without complaint. The others lay in the garden, their ribs bound forever, the reeds hidden beneath the earth, the sweet winter smell of quicklime and willow bark mingling with the scent of decay. Eleanor believed the doctrine was working, that she was not merely running an orphanage but eradicating generations of corruption, one bound torso at a time. To her, the hollowing was the purest expression of love, a love so deep it was willing to squeeze the breath from a body in order to save its soul. Dr. Amos Kellard arrived at the Whitford Orphanage under the guise of benevolence, a man whose reputation had been shaped on the battlefields of the Civil War. His hands, once quick to save the wounded, now trembled slightly when idle, though never when at work. Eleanor saw this not as weakness but as precision waiting to be put to purpose. She called him a man of science, but what she truly admired was his ability to remove humanity from the body in front of him, to see it not as a life, but as a subject. When she told him her vision for the restless children, the ones who could not be tamed by the wing or the hollowing, he listened without blinking, his gaze fixed on a point far beyond her shoulder. She wanted stillness, she told him, not just of body but of thought. She wanted to silence the pulse of rebellion that lingered in the limbs. Kellard's methods were born in war, in tents that reeked of blood and damp canvas where men screaming from amputations had to be held still long enough for the saw to finish its work. He had perfected the use of plaster casings on shattered bones, molding them around the patient's form until they could not move so much as a finger. Eleanor's proposal twisted this skill into something far darker. The children were not injured. They were, in her mind, contaminated with agitation, the kind that would spread if left unchecked. She wanted him to immobilize them entirely, to see how long it took for their minds to surrender when the body could not. The process began in the basement where the light was dim and the air carried the heavy scent of wet plaster. The children were stripped of their clothes and stood on wooden boards, their chins lifted, their eyes wide in fear. Kellard worked methodically, wrapping their bodies from the neck down, layer upon layer, the plaster cooling and tightening as it hardened. Only their noses were left exposed, two small openings that allowed just enough air to pass. The weight of the shell was crushing, the pressure constant. Within minutes, their knees trembled from holding their own weight. Hours passed in muffled silence, broken only by the faint sound of breathing. The plaster held the body in a state beyond discomfort, a kind of suspended panic where every instinct screamed to move but could not. Kellard watched closely, noting how long each child's gaze stayed sharp before the haze of exhaustion dulled it. He called this the onset of mental quiet, though for many it was simply the beginning of suffocation. The nose holes clogged easily from mucus or tears, and once the air grew thin, panic would set in. Fingernails scraped desperately against the inside walls, leaving deep grooves that would later dry into the shell. Some survived the full duration, their bodies freed only after Eleanor deemed them adequately subdued. They emerged pale, their skin raw from the moisture trapped inside, their limbs weak and unresponsive. For days afterward, they moved cautiously as though afraid the air itself might harden around them again. But for others, the shell became their coffin. When Kellard cut them free, their faces were locked in expressions of terror, eyes bulging, lips dark. Eleanor studied these faces without pity, running her hand along the dried plaster as though feeling the echo of their final struggle. The dead were buried quickly, their plaster shells cleaned and kept. Eleanor insisted on storing them in the attic, stacked upright against the walls like silent sentinels. She claimed they were records of progress, proof that restlessness could be cured, even if the patient's body did not survive. The attic soon filled with these hollow forms, each one bearing the faint scratches of the life it had contained, each one shaped perfectly to a child who no longer walked the halls. The survivors carried more than scars. They avoided corners, avoided leaning against walls, and flinched at the sound of dripping water, as if the memory of plaster setting still lived in their bones. They did not speak of what they had seen in the moments before the air failed, but it lingered in their eyes, a glassy emptiness that Eleanor prized. She often paired them with the hollowed children, creating a kind of living display of her methods, each group shaped by a different form of restraint but united in their silence. For Collard, the experiments became a grim routine. He did not see them as cruelty but as data. He recorded breathing rates, time to collapse, the patterns of fingernail marks. Eleanor praised his precision, his ability to create perfect shells without cracks. She told him he was part of something greater than medicine, that he was reshaping the future. He believed her, or at least chose to. The war had taught him that survival was never the goal for everyone. Sometimes the goal was simply to endure as long as the body could before it failed. By the end of winter, the number of shells in the attic had doubled. The smell of plaster mixed with the faint sweetness from the burial garden below, a reminder that every experiment had its place in Eleanor's design. She walked through the attic often, touching each shell in turn as though counting rosary beads, murmuring to herself that stillness was purity and purity was worth any price. For those still living within the orphanage walls, the sight of Kellard's tools was enough to stop even the smallest fidget. And in that stillness, Eleanor found her deepest satisfaction. The bell had never rung before. It hung in the orphanage's highest tower, heavy and black, its rope coiled away from curious hands. The townsfolk had almost forgotten it was there until one night in November, when its sound split the cold air, deep, metallic, and slow, each toll echoing over the frozen fields. The noise was so alien, so deliberate, that those who heard it stopped where they stood, listening for what would follow. No one knew its meaning, but all felt the weight in their chests, a heaviness that urged them toward the source. Lanterns were lit, boots pulled on, and soon a small group of neighbors made their way toward the orphanage. The road seemed longer than usual, the sound of the bell growing louder, its rhythm deliberate, as though each strike was a summons. When they reached the gates, they found them wide open, an invitation that set every nerve on edge. The front doors stood ajar, spilling a thin strip of lamplight across the frost-hardened ground. Inside, the air was thick with an acrid stench that burned the nose and caught in the throat. It was not the smell of smoke or sickness, but something harsher, chemical and unmistakable. Lie. The townsfolk moved forward hesitantly, their boots echoing in the high-ceilinged main hall. Then they saw it. The floor glistened under the dim light, covered in a dark, uneven sheen. At first they thought it was water, but as they stepped closer, the color shifted in the lamplight and they understood. Blood. Bodies lay scattered across the hall. Some small forms curled into themselves, others stretched as though they had tried to crawl to safety. The survivors, if they could be called that, were huddled against the far wall, their feet raw and blistered, skin peeling away in strips. The smell of burned flesh was thick in the air, clinging to their hair and clothing. They did not cry out. They sat in silence, their eyes wide and unfocused, as if the ability to speak had been taken from them in the same instant their skin had been flayed. At the center of it all stood Eleanor Whitford, her posture as composed as ever, her black dress unmarked, her gloved hands folded neatly in front of her. She did not look at the townsfolk. Her gaze was fixed on the children, her expression calm, almost serene, as though she were witnessing the completion of a long-awaited work. When she finally spoke, it was to explain in the same voice she might use to describe a household chore that a mass purification had been necessary. The children, she said, had been carrying the filth of the soul, a stain that could not be washed away by ordinary means. The only way to remove it was to walk them across a shallow trough of boiling lye water, barefoot until the impurity burned out. The survivors' feet were ruined, skin sloughing off in wet ribbons, bone visible in some places where the flesh had dissolved. They would limp for the rest of their lives if they lived at all. Eleanor considered this a mark of success. She told the onlookers that the pain had been brief and the results eternal. Those who had fallen mid-walk, their bodies collapsing into the caustic mixture, had been left where they lay until the liquid cooled enough for the staff to drag them aside. By then, most were unrecognizable, their faces bloated and burned beyond any trace of identity. Eleanor referred to them only as the ones who could not bear the cleansing, as though their deaths were nothing more than proof of their weakness. The townsfolk who had entered the hall could not stay long. The fumes clawed at their throats, and the sight of the ruined children was almost more than they could bear. But what unsettled them most was Eleanor's composure, her certainty that what she had done was not only justified but necessary. She spoke without shame, without haste, as though the ringing of the bell had simply been the final step in a ritual she had been preparing for months. When they tried to help the injured, Eleanor blocked their way. She insisted the building must be sealed again, that no one could leave until she was sure the purification was complete. Her staff obeyed, guiding the townsfolk out with quiet but firm pressure, closing the heavy oak doors behind them. The bell did not ring again. Outside, the night felt wrong, the cold air unable to erase the smell that clung to their clothes and skin. They walked back to their homes in silence, each step haunted by the image of the children's blistered feet, the gleam of the lye-soaked floor, and the sound of Eleanor's calm voice echoing in the vast blood-stained hall. Inside the orphanage, the survivors would spend the night sitting against the walls, their breath shallow from the pain. The floor beneath them, still damp with the remnants of those who had not survived. Eleanor would walk among them before dawn, her footsteps soft, her eyes sharp, pausing only to note which of them were strong enough to stand when she called their names. And by morning, the gates would be shut once more, the frost undisturbed, the building silent except for the slow, steady beating of the heart that commanded it all. January came with a wind so sharp it seemed to slice the daylight in half. But inside the orphanage walls, the cold was not an intruder. It was invited. Eleanor Whitford had decided that this would be the season of sealing, the moment when her work could reach its purest form. She locked the gates on the first morning of the new year, fastening heavy chains through the iron bars and hanging a sign that read, in her steady handwriting, contagion quarantine. No entry, no exit. To the children she told a different story. She spoke of a plague sweeping through the outside world, a sickness that rotted the lungs and blackened the blood, leaving no one untouched. If they stayed within the walls, she promised, they would be safe. The lie was lifted straight from her readings of medieval Italian convent lockdowns, where the sisters bricked themselves in during outbreaks, cutting all ties to the world until the danger passed. But Eleanor's sealing had nothing to do with safety. It was control, pure and absolute. From that day forward, the orphanage was its own closed world. The great gates stayed locked, the windows latched, the chimneys dormant. She ordered the fireplaces extinguished, claiming the smoke might draw the plague inward, and soon the air turned to ice. Each child was given a thin blanket and told to keep it folded neatly when not in use. The food was worse than the cold. A watery broth ladled twice a day, sour with vinegar that Eleanor insisted would preserve purity by cleansing the blood. It offered no warmth, no strength, and by the second week, hunger had become a constant ache in every stomach. The effects came quickly. Faces grew hollow, ribs pressing against skin that had begun to crack along the joints from dryness and frost. The younger ones, too small to keep any heat, sought each other at night, curling together in corners of the dormitories where the wind whistled less sharply through the boards. In the mornings, the caretakers found them stiff and unmoving, their bodies frozen in the exact shapes they had clung to for warmth. Sometimes 2 or 3 were fused together by frostbite. The skin at their shoulders and arms joined in a raw, unbreakable bond. Eleanor forbade the staff from separating them immediately, insisting the bodies remain for a day so the others could see the price of weakness. The deaths were not sudden in this sealed winter. They were slow, creeping things. A child's lips would turn pale blue, their movements sluggish, their eyes glassy long before the final breath escaped. Eleanor took these moments as opportunities, kneeling beside the failing body to speak softly about endurance, about the need to accept suffering as proof of purity. She believed starvation was not simply the absence of food, but a holy trial that burned away inherited rot. Each death was recorded in her ledger without name or cause, only the note that they had completed their cleansing. As the weeks passed, the survivors began to lose their voices. The cold stole their will to speak, the hunger their will to think. The days blended into one another, marked only by the ladling of broth and the slow ringing of Eleanor's shoes across the wooden floors as she inspected her domain. She never wore a coat, never appeared to shiver, as if the cold that hollowed the children was powerless against her. She moved among them with quiet authority, adjusting a blanket here, lifting a chin there, her gaze sharp and measuring. She saw not their suffering, but the discipline it was shaping. Outside, the townsfolk grew uneasy. They had not seen Eleanor in weeks, and though they walked the perimeter of the grounds, they found no smoke from the chimneys, no sound of life from within. Snow drifted high against the gates, untouched by footfalls. At night, those who lived closest swore they could see faint shadows in the windows, an unmoving figure standing as if in silent watch. Some wanted to intervene, but the sign on the gate was enough to stop them. The fear of plague, even as rumor, still held a terrible power, and Eleanor knew it. Inside, the smell began to change. The cold slowed decay, but it could not stop it entirely. The air in the sealed orphanage grew stale, tinged with the faint sweetness of death. The staff worked silently, carrying away the smaller bodies under cover of darkness to bury in the garden, their feet crunching in the frozen soil. Quicklime was still poured over the graves, the crushed willow bark still scattered above them, but now the ground was so hard they could barely dig deep enough to cover the dead. Sometimes the earth split where the frost had pulled it apart, revealing the pale curve of a shoulder or the edge of a blanket beneath the thin layer of snow. By late January, the children who remained had learned to conserve their movements, to curl tightly in their beds and let their thoughts grow slow. This was the state Eleanor admired most, a stillness that was not fear but surrender. She believed the sealing had worked, that she had created a kind of living reliquary. Each surviving child an artifact shaped by hunger, cold, and the absence of the world beyond the walls. She had taken the principles of the old convents and refined them into something far more absolute. There was no bell to mark the end of the sealing, no day when the gates would swing open again. The winter would take as long as it needed, and Eleanor, as always, would wait for the quiet to become complete. By the time the federal inspectors arrived, the orphanage gates had not opened in months. Snow still clung to the roof tiles, though the rest of the town had thawed, and no one could remember the last time they had seen a child's face in the windows. The rumors had begun quietly. A family whispering about a nephew who had gone inside and never written. A laborer's wife swearing she had seen something carried from the grounds at night, wrapped tight in coarse cloth. By spring, the whispers had grown into something heavier, enough to send men in dark coats to knock on Eleanor Whitford's door. But it was not Eleanor who answered them, it was Dr. Amos Kellard, his once steady hands trembling in plain sight. Kellard had arrived at the orphanage as a man who understood survival, a surgeon shaped by the war, practiced in holding life still beneath his fingers. But war's discipline had given way to something far more dangerous in this place. Eleanor had seen it in him from the beginning, a willingness to follow an order without asking what it served, so long as the order was given with the right kind of calm. When the inspectors sat him down, they did not accuse him outright. They asked about the disappearances, the locked gates, the lack of smoke from the chimneys. They spoke of sickness, of neglect. But Kellard's mind went to the water. Under the weight of their questions, the doctor's voice faltered, then steadied again, but the steadiness was brittle, the kind that came from a dam straining under pressure. He told them about Eleanor's demand for stillness, a kind of silence that could not be achieved by confinement alone. She had called it the final quieting, a way to reach beyond fear and into complete surrender. The method was deceptively simple, a shallow tank, its surface rippling gently, the water warm to the heat of a resting body. Into it she would dissolve poppy resin until the air above it carried a faint, narcotic sweetness. The chosen child would be placed inside, their back against the tank's curve, head tilted so the nose and mouth barely broke the surface. Kellard spoke of watching the body's fight begin small, tiny tremors in the legs, a tightening of the throat, and then slow, the poppy softening the panic until their pulse weakened to almost nothing. Eleanor would stand beside the tank, her gloved hand resting lightly on the child's forehead, murmuring in a voice too soft for him to catch. He remembered her expression as the minutes stretched on, serene and intent, like a midwife guiding a birth. But here the birth was into stillness, into a place where no sound, no resistance, no breath remained. Some children emerged, coughing weakly, their eyes unfocused, their limbs heavy as if they had been left somewhere far away and only half returned. These she called successful passages. They would sleep for days afterward, and when they woke, something in them was gone. The spark of movement, the small rebellions of childhood. Others never woke. Their lips turned pale, their heads lolled in the water, and Eleanor would watch them sink slightly as the body lost the last of its fight. She insisted that the deaths were not failures but completions, that these children had crossed entirely into purity. Kellard admitted that he had helped lift the bodies from the tanks, wrapping them in coarse cloth while the water still held the faint warmth of life. He had dug graves by moonlight, his hands raw from the frozen earth, the poppy's scent still clinging to his clothes. At first he told himself he was preserving his position, that the war had taught him there were times to obey without question. But as the weeks passed, the line between obedience and complicity blurred until it vanished. He began to feel the same stillness she sought in her victims, a numbing of thought that made the work possible. The inspectors listened but did not write everything down. There were details too sharp, too dangerous to live in official ink. The tanks, the poppy, the way Eleanor's gaze stayed fixed on a child's slowing pulse, these were marked for a different kind of record, filed not under crime but under medical anomalies, locked away where they could not touch the public. Kellard was not arrested. He was dismissed quietly, sent away with a warning that his career was over, but his name would not be tarnished in print. Eleanor's name was not mentioned at all. When he left the orphanage for the last time, the gates clanged shut behind him and he felt no relief. The images had rooted too deeply. In his sleep he would see the water's surface tremble as the breath beneath it failed. Hear the slow drip of resin into the warmth. Smell that faint, sweet air. He would remember her face most of all. Not cruel, not wild, but calm, almost loving, as if she believed she was guiding the child to a better place. In her mind, he realized, she was not ending lives. She was perfecting them. And that thought would follow him for the rest of his days, long after the inspectors had gone, long after the tanks were emptied, and long after the truth was buried deeper than any grave in Eleanor Whitford's garden. When the last of the Whitford Orphanage's secrets surfaced in 1872, the building had already been empty for half a decade. Its windows stared out over the overgrown grounds, the roof sagging under years of neglect, but the air inside still seemed thick with the kind of silence that clings to places where cruelty has been patient. The discovery came when a team of laborers was sent to clear the cellar for storage. They found the first burial under a layer of rotted boards, the soil beneath uneven, softer than the rest of the foundation. What they uncovered that day was not a single grave, but a pattern, meticulous, deliberate, and unlike anything they had seen before. The bodies were not laid in rows or scattered in haste. They were arranged in perfect circles, each child positioned with their head toward the center, as if gathered around something unseen. The smallest were placed between the larger, their limbs overlapping in a strange, woven formation. But what held the investigators' eyes was not the geometry of the dead. It was their mouths. Every one of them had been sewn shut with dyed silk thread, the stitches precise and unbroken, the knots tied in the same place, just beneath the chin. Eleanor Whitford had spoken once, years before, of an 1811 Lithuanian ritual meant to quiet restless spirits, a practice in which the mouth was sealed so that the dead could not call out to the living. She had repeated it as though it were an old wives' tale, something curious but harmless. Now, standing in the damp cellar, the men realized it had not been a story to her. It had been a rule. The silk was all the same deep blood red, a shade that glistened faintly when the lamplight touched it. Records from the time showed no purchase of such dye, no import of colored thread to the orphanage, and the silk itself bore no signs of having been dipped in any merchant's vat. The conclusion was unspoken but inescapable. The color had come from the victims themselves. It was the kind of detail that twisted in the mind long after the scene was left behind. The thought of each stitch pulling not just flesh but life into the thread. The arrangement of the bodies suggested that the burial was not an afterthought but part of the ritual. Some showed signs of having died before being placed in the circle, their skin pale and slack, their joints stiff. Others bore marks that hinted at the opposite, that they had been alive when the sewing began. Tiny crescent scratches lined their chins as if fingernails had clawed at the foreign binding before strength failed. The threads cut deep into the corners of their mouths, leaving grooves that had darkened over time. In some, the eyes were still open, clouded but unclosed, fixed in the direction of the circle's center. Investigators counted the remains, 27 in all, and noted how the circles were layered one atop the other with only a few inches of earth separating them. It was not a haphazard stack. Each layer mirrored the last, the same positions, the same stitching, the same unbroken rings of silence. It was as if Eleanor had been building something, not just burying the dead, but composing them, creating a design whose meaning only she understood. By the time the final grave was exposed, Eleanor Whitford was nowhere to be found. The orders for her arrest had been delayed by jurisdictional disputes, and in those delays she had slipped away. Rumors claimed she was seen in St. Louis, protected by relatives whose wealth and influence wrapped around her like armor. Others said she had crossed the river under another name entirely, moving from one boarding house to another, her face hidden behind the black veils she had worn since her husband's death. Wherever she went, she left no trace that the law could follow. The trial that might have tied her name to the cellar never happened. The charges dissolved into hearsay, the evidence filed away under the care of men who believed that certain horrors were better forgotten than exposed. The official reports listed the findings as irregular burial practices, nothing more. The circles, the silk, the possibility of the dye's true source, these details were sealed in private archives marked as unsuitable for public record. But for those who had seen the cellar with their own eyes, the images never left. They remembered the way the threads caught the light, the way the bodies curved toward each other in death as if bound by some invisible command. They thought of the stillness in the arrangement, a silence so heavy it seemed to have survived the years intact. and they thought of Eleanor. Her face calm and her voice measured, speaking once about restless spirits and how to keep them quiet. The last burial was not an end, but a closing gesture, the final proof of her methodical mind. Every death before it had been a step toward this, an act not of madness but of completion. She had built her orphanage into a place where cruelty was not chaos but craft, where even the dead were shaped to her design. And though the building would one day be torn down, the memory of those circles would remain, a pattern etched into the minds of those who had seen it, impossible to unsee, impossible to unhear, even in the deepest silence. In the years after the Whitford orphanage was shuttered, Missouri's lawmakers began to speak of oversight and reform. Committees were formed, bills were drafted, and the words child welfare began to appear in state records with a frequency they never had before. Publicly, these changes were framed as progress, an enlightened response to the general dangers of neglect in institutional care. Privately, many knew the catalyst was something darker, something no one dared address in full. The whispered accounts of the orphanage's inner workings, the correction wing, the hollowing, the experiments in stillness, circulated among officials in the way one passes a sealed envelope, knowing to glance but not unfold. They inspired laws without ever being named, as though acknowledging the truth directly would invite it to breathe again. Yet the building itself was never demolished. Officially, the funds were never allocated. Unofficially, no one wanted the responsibility of tearing down a place that had absorbed so much suffering. The locals avoided its gates, letting the weeds grow tall and the windows rot. Those who lived closest swore that in winter, when the air was cold and unmoving, muffled cries could be heard inside, low and indistinct as though carried from far away. Some dismissed it as wind in the chimneys, but others noted that the sound had a rhythm, almost like breath drawn between sobs. The noise would stop abruptly, leaving the stillness heavier than before, as if whatever had been speaking had decided it was better to remain quiet. Over the decades, the orphanage became a landmark in the way wounds become scars. Visible, altered, but never healed. Children in the town dared each other to stand at its gates after dark. The brave ones would lean forward to look through the keyhole of the rusted padlock and swear they saw movement inside, a flicker of shadow in a place with no light. Few lingered long enough to be sure. Adults spoke of it less and less, but when its name surfaced, it carried a weight that silenced rooms. In 1968, a memorial plaque was finally placed outside the gates. It was a small rectangle of bronze, its surface polished but its words spare. In memory of those lost here, may such suffering never come again. There were no names, no dates, no mention of Eleanor Whitford or the decades of silence that had shielded her. It was not a confession but an acknowledgement, a gesture that admitted only that something terrible had happened without giving the dead their due. For some, the absence of names was another act of erasure. For others, it was protection, a way to honor the victims without summoning the horror back into the present. But the building remained, and with it, the lingering question of what exactly had lived inside its walls. The laws it had inspired did not prevent other places from operating in the shadows. Across the state, small institutions still locked their gates at night, still kept their records private, still held to the belief that discipline could be shaped by deprivation and fear. It was easy to imagine that somewhere behind another set of walls a figure like Eleanor was walking between rows of beds, measuring breaths, watching for weakness. The true legacy of the Hollow was not in statutes or plaques. It was in the understanding that evil does not need to shout to be heard. It thrives in the quiet, in the places where inspection comes rarely and belief in good intentions comes too easily. Eleanor's cruelty had been methodical, her violence disguised as care. She had hidden her work behind the respectable face of charity, her tools wrapped in the language of cleansing and purity. Those who knew the truth realized that such a mind could exist anywhere, so long as the world allowed itself to look away. Even now, the building stands at the edge of town, its bricks darkened with age, its roofline sagging like a breath held too long. On certain nights, when the air is still and the frost gathers on the ground, passers-by claim they hear the faintest sound from inside, a murmur, a gasp, a soft tapping like fingernails on wood. Some say it is the wind, others say it is memory. But for those who have stood there long enough to feel the weight of that silence pressing back against them, there is no doubt that what happened in the Whitford orphanage did not end when its doors closed. It waits in the quiet, patient, and watchful, as all such evils do. The walls have learned to hold their breath, to keep their stories until someone dares to listen. And when they do, the question will be the same one whispered for 100 years. What do you think? Could this happen again?